The Arizona sun was a blazing orange as it crested over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth of Copper Ridge. The air was thick with the heat of the early afternoon, carrying the smell of dust and sweat. The sound of hooves echoed down the dusty main street, stirring up the townsfolk as they went about their business. But as the rider approached, the town went silent, the familiar rhythm of life faltering for a moment, as though the land itself held its breath. Silas Grim, the man who had ruled Copper Ridge with an iron fist for the past decade, stood in the doorway of Murphy's saloon. His rough hands were clasped behind his back, and his dark eyes scanned the street with the practiced calm of a man who had seen too much to be easily rattled. Yet today, for the first time in years, something gnawed at the edges of his composure. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, a feeling that something long buried was about to come crawling back into the light. And then, from the edge of town, a woman rode in. Her silhouette stood stark against the setting sun, a dark figure whose presence made the very air seem to vibrate with unspoken tension. Silas's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. She wasn't just any rider. She was Saraphina Blackwood, the little girl he had sold for $50 and a bottle of whiskey 7 years ago. But now, she wasn't a helpless child. She was a woman, hardened by time and circumstances, a woman who had come back to collect on a debt that had been due for far too long. As she dismounted, her boots striking the earth with a determined thud, Silas could see it in her eyes. The fire, the fury, the hunger for justice that had been smoldering inside her for all these years. And Silas knew, with a sickening certainty, that his time had come. The sins of his past were about to be paid for in full. The sun hung like a molten orb over the Arizona desert, casting its golden light over the dry, cracked earth of Copper Ridge. The town sat in the dusty embrace of a relentless heat wave, where the air shimmered and warped on the horizon. The main street, a few hundred feet of weather-beaten wooden planks and dusty, sun-bleached storefronts, felt like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The air was thick with the smell of old whiskey, sweat, and unwashed cattle. It was the kind of place that had learned to forget and move on until now. There, standing in the doorway of Murphy's saloon, Silas Grim felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. A shiver, a coldness creeping down his spine. It was a momentary hesitation, fleeting, but enough to make him pause in his casual stance, his hand instinctively brushing the worn edge of his belt. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of the desert with it, but there was something else in the air now, something that unsettled him. For the last 7 years, Silas had built a life in Copper Ridge. He'd carved out a small kingdom here, with his saloon, his land, and his business dealings all neatly arranged. He was a man who had made peace with his past, someone who had long ago learned to bury the things that haunted him. But today, that past was not so easily buried. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance. At first, it was faint, a mere whisper on the wind. But it grew louder, louder still, until it became unmistakable, a rhythmic drumming of hooves on dry earth, coming toward the town like a storm. It was as though the earth itself was waking up, groaning beneath the weight of the approaching rider. The people of Copper Ridge, once bustling about their business, began to pause and turn their eyes toward the horizon. Silas squinted into the sun, his weathered hand shielding his eyes from the blinding light. He could see the figure, distant at first, just a dark silhouette against the glare of the midday sun. It was a rider, moving steadily toward him, cutting through the dust like a knife through the fabric of the town. As the rider drew closer, Silas felt his breath catch in his chest. There was something familiar about the way they sat in the saddle, the way they moved with such purpose. It wasn't just any rider. It was a woman. Silas's heart skipped a beat, and he straightened. His mind raced, trying to place the figure, but no name or face came to mind. He had seen many riders pass through Copper Ridge over the years, but this one carried with her a weight that felt different, a presence that filled the space between the dust and the shadows. She was wearing a weathered hat, the brim low enough to obscure her face. But it wasn't the hat or the worn leather vest she wore that caught Silas's attention. It was the way she rode, the way her posture was so straight, so determined. It was the kind of composure Silas had seen in only a few men in his life. The kind of composure that came from years of surviving the harshest of conditions. But it was her eyes that made Silas's heart freeze in his chest. He couldn't see them yet, but he knew. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had been broken, only to rebuild themselves into something far more dangerous. As the rider neared, Silas stepped forward, one hand hovering over his holster. He had long ago learned to carry his weapons close, even when the sun was high and the air was still. In Copper Ridge, a man never knew when trouble would come calling. The rider stopped her horse a few feet in front of him, her steely eyes locked onto his. Silas's breath hitched. It took him a moment to gather himself, his mind racing back through the years, trying to place her. The woman slid off her horse with practiced ease. She moved toward him with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing in the quiet street. There was no rush in her movements, no fear. She wasn't here for a confrontation. She was here for something more. "Uncle Silas," she said, her voice cutting through the air with a coldness that made the heat of the desert seem mild. The word struck Silas like a thunderclap. He hadn't heard that name in years. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't let it cross his mind. And now, hearing it from her lips, he knew with a sinking certainty that this was no ordinary day. This was not some random traveler. This was the past, returned to collect what was due. Silas's heart thudded in his chest, and he felt the blood drain from his face. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman took another step closer, and Silas instinctively backed away, his hand reaching for his gun, but not drawing it yet. He didn't need to. She wasn't here for that. "Not yet," I said, she repeated, her voice colder now, harder. "Uncle Silas, it's been a long time. 7 years, in fact. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." Silas's mind raced as the memories flooded back. 7 years ago, a girl, no more than 12, had been torn from her family's homestead. The fire that had consumed the Blackwood place had been set intentionally, and Silas, along with Tobias Kane, had made sure there were no witnesses. The girl, Saraphina, had been sold off to the highest bidder. He'd thought she was gone for good, dead, probably like the rest of her family. But here she was, alive, standing in front of him, staring at him with a look in her eyes that was anything but forgiveness. "You were just a child," Silas muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice trembling as he tried to piece together the past. You thought I was dead?" she finished for him. "Well, I wasn't, and I didn't die in a fire. I survived. I survived because I learned, Uncle Silas. I learned how to survive." She wasn't a child anymore. The little girl he had sold was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. A woman who had learned to track, to fight, and to make men like him regret their every decision. "I didn't come here to kill you," she continued, her eyes hard, fixed on him. "I came here to collect my inheritance. What's rightfully mine, the land, the ranch." Silas's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of her words hit him. The Blackwood land, the property he had taken so easily, so ruthlessly, was now the center of this confrontation. But it wasn't just about the land. It was about the life he had stolen from her, the childhood he had robbed her of, and the family he had helped destroy. Saraphina reached into her vest pocket and pulled out something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. It was a tarnished locket, the same locket he had seen years ago, the one he had taken from Martha Blackwood's neck the night they killed her. The same locket that had been passed from hand to hand across the desert until it found its way back to Saraphina. She held it up for him to see, the light catching the tarnished silver. "You remember this, don't you?" she asked, her voice low, steady. "You took it from my mother's neck. You thought it would keep you safe, but it didn't. And now it's come home." The locket, tarnished and battered by time, had survived in the same way Saraphina had survived. It was a symbol of what Silas had done, and now it was the key to his undoing. Silas stumbled backward, the realization sinking in like a heavy stone. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. And Saraphina Blackwood was here to serve it. The dust still hung in the air like a thick, choking fog, and the sunlight seemed to grow sharper, more unforgiving. The town of Copper Ridge was suddenly smaller, tighter, as if the very buildings themselves leaned in to listen to the inevitable. Saraphina Blackwood stood in the middle of the street, a living embodiment of everything Silas Grim had tried to bury. The wind picked up again, swirling the dust in small, controlled tornadoes around her. She wasn't waiting for a response. She wasn't waiting for anything. She had already made her choice. In the silence that stretched between them, Silas could feel his past pressing in on him from all sides. His heart was pounding, his breath shallow. The memories, long buried, began to claw their way to the surface. The fire, the screams, the deal with Tobias Kane, the way he had felt the weight of his conscience slip away when he handed over the girl. It had seemed like nothing at the time, just another transaction. But now, as Seraphina's cold eyes bore into him, it felt like a weight too heavy to carry. 7 years, Silas. Seraphina's voice cut through his thoughts, her words crisp and sharp as the desert wind. 7 years of pain, of surviving, of hunting you down. And now here you are, standing in front of me like nothing ever happened. You really thought you could get away with it. Silas opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't lie, not this time. The truth had a way of standing up in moments like this, louder than any justification or excuse. He had done what he had done, and now the consequences were here, standing in the street before him, a young woman turned weapon, her very presence a testament to his crimes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to see her alive. It wasn't just the girl he had sold. It was everything she represented. She was the living memory of his actions, the one person who had escaped his grasp, who had risen from the ashes of her past and returned to demand retribution. I didn't, Silas started, but his voice faltered. There were no words that could undo what he had done, no apology that could make it right. Seraphina's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied him, the faintest glimmer of something like pity in them. But it wasn't the pity of a victim. It was the pity of someone who had long since grown beyond being a victim, someone who had become the instrument of justice, and now that justice was here, it would not be denied. Save it, she said, her voice steady but cold. I don't need your apologies, Silas. I don't need your remorse. I need something much more valuable. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dry earth, and Silas couldn't help but step back, his instincts telling him that the distance between them was all that stood between him and a reckoning he wasn't ready for. He could feel his heart in his throat, a sense of dread gnawing at him as she came closer. The heat of the desert didn't feel so oppressive anymore. Instead, it felt like the slow build of a storm, heavy and thick, waiting to break. Seraphina reached into her vest and pulled out the small, weathered locket again, holding it up in front of him like a silent accusation. This locket belonged to my mother, she said, her voice as soft as a whisper, but the weight of it hung in the air like a 100-pound stone. You took it from her when you murdered her, just before you burned down her homestead. You didn't think anyone would remember, did you? Silas clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. The memories, the images of that night flooded his mind. The crackling of the fire, the screams as Martha Blackwood had begged for her life, the cold satisfaction that had filled him when he had taken the locket, like it was a prize to be claimed. He had thought it was over. He had thought that if he erased the Blackwood family, they would be gone forever. But Seraphina had come back, like a ghost seeking vengeance, and now that she was here, he realized just how wrong he had been. You think this is justice? He sneered, his voice rising, but his words were more desperate than anything else. You think you could just waltz in here and start demanding things? You're just a kid, Seraphina. You don't know what you're messing with. A flicker of something passed across her face, something that might have been a smirk, but it was gone before Silas could be sure. I know exactly what I'm messing with, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, but with a firmness that cut through the tension like a knife. I know exactly who you are, and I know who you're not. You're not the man you want everyone to believe you are. You're a coward, Silas. A coward who hides behind the laws of men, behind money, behind power. You always have been. But it's different now. This isn't just about me. It's about the families you destroyed. It's about the lives you ruined. You can't escape that. The heat of the desert pressed in on him, making him feel small, insignificant. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, but they weren't looking at him with the same respect they had once had. They were watching him like a man who had finally been caught, like a man who had nowhere to run. Silas wanted to scream, to lash out, but he couldn't. Saraphina had taken away his last defense. He could no longer hide behind his money, his reputation, or his alliances. "You're wrong," he spat, the words escaping him in a rush. "You don't know anything about me. You think you've got all the answers, but you don't know the first thing about what I've been through. I didn't sell you for pleasure, girl. I did it to survive, to protect myself." Seraphina's gaze didn't waver. She didn't flinch or look away. She stood tall, her posture unyielding, as though the weight of everything she had been through had forged her into something unbreakable. "You didn't do it to survive, Silas. You did it because you could. You did it because you thought you could get away with it." The silence between them was deafening. Silas could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He knew, deep down, that she was right. He had done it because he could. He had made a choice that had led him here, to this very moment, standing in front of the woman he had betrayed, waiting for her to deliver the justice he had long since convinced himself he would never face. "I want what's mine," Saraphina said, her voice low but carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. "The ranch. The land. My inheritance." Silas opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. There was nothing left to say. The world he had built in Copper Ridge was about to crumble beneath him, and there was no one left to save him. Saraphina took another step forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her gun. It was a small, deliberate movement, a warning. "The Blackwood Ranch is mine. It's been mine since the day you burned my family alive. You've spent the last 7 years hiding from your sins, Silas, but now it's time to pay. And I've come to collect." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Silas could feel the weight of them settling into his bones. There was no escape, no redemption, no way to undo what he had done. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was no running from it. The wind picked up again, swirling dust and debris into the air as Seraphina's words settled on Silas like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of her declaration spread through Copper Ridge, and for the first time in years, Silas felt the weight of his past finally crushing down on him. It was no longer something he could deny or deflect. It wasn't just about the ranch, the land, or the money. It was about everything he had done to survive and the consequences he had never imagined he would have to face. Seraphina stood before him, unflinching, her eyes like steel, cold, unforgiving, and full of fire. She wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't the scared girl who had been sold off into the darkness of human trafficking. She was a woman, hardened by years of struggle, revenge, and survival. A woman who had turned every ounce of her pain into the sharpest weapon of justice. And now, she stood ready to make Silas pay for what he had done to her and her family. The townspeople watched in silence. They knew Silas. They knew Tobias. But they didn't know Seraphina. She was the ghost in the shadows, the one who had disappeared 7 years ago, the one whose name had been whispered in fear and disbelief. But now she was here, standing in the middle of the street, holding the power of the truth in her hands, and the town was forced to reckon with the consequences of Silas Grim's past. Silas took a hesitant step back, his boots grinding into the dirt, his hands still hovering near the grip of his gun. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something worse. It was the realization that he had nowhere left to run, no one left to save him. He had spent his life building a facade of power, of influence, and now it was all slipping away, piece by piece, at the hands of a woman who had no intention of showing mercy. "You don't have to do this," Silas finally said, his voice hoarse. His words were weak, desperate, and he knew they would have no effect. There was no room for negotiation anymore. Saraphina's eyes, cold as the Arizona desert, locked onto his, and for a moment, Silas saw the ghost of the child he had betrayed. The child who had cried for mercy, for help, and whose cries he had ignored in favor of his own selfish survival. "I've been patient, Silas," Saraphina said, her voice steady, every word wrapped in the kind of conviction that made grown men shudder. "I've spent 7 years tracking you, learning everything I could about you, about your empire of lies. I've learned your weaknesses, your habits. I've learned how you operate. And now it's time to finish what I started." Silas opened his mouth to protest, but the words were no longer there. He was no longer the man who controlled Copper Ridge. He wasn't the one with the power. The power had shifted, and Saraphina held it in the palm of her hand. And in that moment, he understood something that had been growing in the pit of his stomach for days. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the will of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Tobias Kane stood behind him, a shadow of his former self. The sight of Saraphina had drained the color from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. He had been a part of this, part of the destruction of her family, part of the deal that had sold her into a life of hell. And now, he was just another pawn in a game that had long since passed its point of no return. He looked at Silas, his hands twitching nervously at his sides, as if trying to find a way out, but there was no escape for either of them. "She's right, Silas," Tobias whispered, his voice cracking. "It's over." The words hit Silas harder than any bullet could. Tobias, the man who had stood beside him for years, the man who had helped him cover up his crimes, had just given up. The weight of the betrayal was palpable. But Saraphina wasn't looking at Tobias. She wasn't looking at anyone except Silas, the man who had condemned her to a life of misery. Saraphina reached into her vest pocket and pulled out something small, something metal. Silas recognized it immediately. It was the locket, the same locket he had stolen from her mother's neck all those years ago. It had survived the fire, survived the years, and now it was back in Saraphina's hands. The same hands that had learned to survive and to hunt, to track down the men who had thought they could escape their past. "Do you remember this, Silas?" she asked, her voice as cold as the steel that filled her veins. "Do you remember what you took from me? What you took from my mother?" Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. The memories of that night were flooding back, and they were choking him. He remembered the screams, the fire, the way he had watched the Blackwood homestead burn, and how he had taken everything of value, including the locket. He had taken all, and in doing so, he had destroyed something far more precious than any piece of gold or silver. Saraphina opened the locket, revealing the photograph inside. It was a picture of her mother, her father, and the small, innocent girl who had once been her. Silas felt a pang of guilt. He had destroyed a family. And for what? For power? For money? It didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. Saraphina had won. The truth had won. "You thought I'd be dead by now, didn't you?" Saraphina asked, her eyes narrowing. "You thought you could bury me like you buried my family, and that no one would ever know the truth." Silas felt the weight of her words like an anchor pulling him deeper into the earth. She was right. He had thought she was gone, forgotten, lost to the world. But she had never been lost. She had been waiting, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right time to make them pay. "I'm not here for revenge, Silas," Saraphina continued, her voice steady. "I'm here for justice, for my family, for all the families you destroyed, for all the lives you ruined. I'm here to make sure you never do this again." The wind howled through Copper Ridge, and for a moment, the street fell silent, the sound of hooves distant but growing louder. Silas could feel the eyes of the town on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. He couldn't face the people who had once respected him, the people who had once trusted him. They were all watching now, waiting for him to make a move, but Silas knew there was no way out. "Do you remember what you told me, Silas?" Saraphina asked, taking a step closer. "You said I was worth 50. You said I'd probably be dead within a year. You were wrong." Silas wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Saraphina had already taken everything from him. His pride, his power, his reputation. He was no longer the man who owned Copper Ridge. He was the man who had been exposed, and there was nowhere left to hide. The sound of approaching hooves was louder now, and Silas turned his head, his heart sinking. He knew what was coming. It was too late. The past had finally caught up with him. The air in Copper Ridge had thickened, as if the very sky understood the weight of the moment. The approaching hooves reverberated in the distance, shaking the ground beneath them. It was the sound of a storm gathering on the horizon, and no one in the crowd dared to move. They had witnessed Saraphina's cold justice in the street, and now they would see the true extent of her plans unfold. But Silas Grim wasn't watching the distant riders. He was watching Saraphina, the girl he thought he had destroyed all those years ago. Her eyes remained locked on him, unwavering, cold as the desert wind, and he felt as if they were stripping him bare. Everything he had fought for, everything he had hidden behind, was gone. Her presence was the reckoning he had feared and denied for so long. The sins of his past were no longer buried in shadows. They stood in the light, and they would not be ignored. The riders crested the hill, their silhouettes cutting through the sun like shadows in a burning sky. There were 8 of them, each one riding tall, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and worn leather. But their presence spoke louder than any words could. Saraphina didn't flinch. She had expected them. In the back of her mind, she had known they would come. The men who still thought they held the reins of power, who believed the years of silence would protect them from what was to come. Who are they? Tobias's voice was weak, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Saraphina didn't answer at first, her gaze fixed on the approaching riders. She knew every one of them. They were men who operated in the shadows, men who trafficked children like cattle, men who had once been her captors, her tormentors. Now, they were nothing but ghosts from a past she had buried deep inside. But Saraphina had learned to live with ghosts. "That's Judge Aldrich Crane at the front," Saraphina said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's the one who's been pulling the strings for years, the one who thought he was untouchable. But everyone has a breaking point." Silas's face drained of color. Judge Aldrich Crane, a man who had sent dozens of criminals to their deaths without a second thought, a man who had been untouchable in his position of power. Saraphina's calmness was unnerving, and Silas realized, with a bitter twinge in his chest, that Saraphina had already outplayed them. "They're here because of you, Silas," Saraphina continued, turning to face him, her voice cold and final. "You sent the telegram. You thought I would be the easy part of your plan, that you could sweep the truth under the rug and keep your empire intact. But you've underestimated me, and now you're going to pay for every life you've ruined." Tobias flinched as her words hit him like a slap. His hand twitched at his side, as if he were considering pulling his gun, but then he glanced at Marshal Pierce, whose rifle never wavered, and Tobias knew that trying to fight his way out would be a futile act of desperation. His partner's earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a creeping fear that made his knees weak. The riders were closer now, their horses kicking up the dust behind them, and the faces of the town began to change. People who had once been intimidated by the power of men like Silas and Tobias now turned their eyes to Saraphina. There was no longer a sense of fear, just silent, collective realization. These were the men who had ruled Copper Ridge for far too long, and the town was finally waking up to the truth. Judge Crane slowed his horse as he reached the front of the crowd, his pale eyes scanning the street with a cold, calculating gaze. He exuded power, his every movement deliberate, as though he knew the very air around him bent to his will. But as his eyes landed on Saraphina, something shifted in his posture, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Miss Blackwood," Judge Crane said, his voice smooth and unhurried, but there was a hint of discomfort beneath the polished exterior. "I must say, you've exceeded all expectations. When I heard a child had escaped the traitors 7 years ago, I assumed you died in the desert." Saraphina's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was nothing kind in it. "Sorry to disappoint, Your Honor," she replied, her voice dripping with irony. "But then, you've been disappointed before, haven't you?" Crane's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough for Saraphina to see. The truth was getting to him. She had spent 7 years meticulously laying out the pieces, and now they were all coming together. She had tracked every movement, every lie, every betrayal, and now, here he was, standing before her like the puppet master who had unknowingly become the puppet. "You were wrong about a lot of things, Crane," Saraphina said, taking a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "But you were right about one thing. Fear. Fear is the only language people like you understand." The crowd behind her shifted uncomfortably, and Silas's breath hitched. The sheriff, who had once been a man of power in Copper Ridge, now stood on the periphery, unsure of what to do. Saraphina had exposed the man behind the badge, the man who had taken bribes to look the other way, to allow men like Silas and Tobias to operate in the shadows. Now, that man was being outmatched by a single woman with nothing but the truth and the patience to make it right. "I'm done running, Crane," Saraphina continued, her voice steady, her hand never leaving the grip of her gun. "I've spent 7 years tracking down every one of your men, every one of your buyers, and now I'm going to destroy your entire operation." Crane's face hardened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Saraphina's confidence was unsettling. It was the confidence of someone who had seen the worst and lived to tell the tale, someone who had fought every day to survive, to learn, to track down the monsters who thought they could escape justice. "You're too late," Crane spat, his voice rising with anger. "This network is bigger than you. There are people in Mexico, in California, in Washington. You can't take down what's already too big." Saraphina's smile remained cold. "You're right," she said, her voice low and lethal. "The network will continue, but not for long." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a thick leather portfolio, filled with documents that no one in Copper Ridge could ignore. Names, dates, shipping routes, buyers, everything that Silas and Tobias thought they had buried, everything that Crane had tried to protect, was now laid out in black and white. Saraphina had spent years collecting the evidence, and now she had it all. "These," Saraphina said, tossing the portfolio at Crane's feet, "are your sins, all laid out for the world to see." The wind picked up again, swirling dust through the streets of Copper Ridge, as if nature itself was eager to witness the conclusion of a long-awaited judgment. The crowd had begun to gather closer, drawn by the magnetic force of Saraphina's resolve, yet none dared to get too close. Everyone knew the game had changed. In one moment, a girl they thought lost forever had returned, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Judge Crane stood frozen in the street, staring down at the leather portfolio that lay in front of him like a tombstone marking the end of his career. The weight of Saraphina's words had shattered whatever remaining confidence he had. She had exposed him in a way he hadn't thought possible. There was no escape now, no twisting of facts, no manipulation of the truth. For the first time in years, Aldrich Crane felt the prickling sensation of fear at the base of his spine. The girl he thought he had silenced forever had become his nightmare. "Pick it up, Crane," Saraphina said, her voice colder than the wind that bit into the skin. She stood tall, unwavering, her hand still resting on the grip of her revolver. "Pick it up and read what you've done." Crane's fingers trembled as they brushed against the portfolio. His mind raced, calculations spinning in his head. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to keep everyone around him in check. But now, the walls were closing in, and he could no longer escape. He opened the portfolio slowly, his gaze falling on the documents that revealed the darkest secrets of his life. His connections to human trafficking, his dealings with corrupt businessmen, his role in the destruction of innocent families. Saraphina had done what no one could. She had dug up the truth, and now was staring him down. The silence that hung over the crowd was oppressive. No one moved, no one spoke. The sound of the wind was the only thing that broke the quiet, rustling through the dry grass like a funeral march. "Is this your legacy, Judge?" Saraphina's voice was a quiet whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 souls. "Is this what you built your name on? A system of corruption, of lies, of lives destroyed? You think you could just walk away from it?" Crane's lips quivered, but he didn't respond. The truth was too damning, too undeniable. He had no defense, no argument to present. The power he once wielded with ease had turned to dust, scattered by the wind of Saraphina's revelation. And in that silence, the weight of her words seemed to settle over the town, wrapping around everyone like a blanket of guilt. "You don't get to decide how this ends, Crane," Saraphina continued, stepping forward. "Not anymore." The crowd, which had been watching with bated breath, now shifted, murmuring among themselves. Some were in awe of Saraphina's courage. Others were scared of what this might mean for them. The dark reality of the town's past, the one that had been buried under years of silence, was now exposed for all to see. For the first time, Copper Ridge had to face the truth. Its prosperity had come at a cost, and that cost had been far too high. Marshal Pierce, who had remained a quiet observer up until this point, now stepped forward, his rifle still at the ready. His face was hard, but his eyes betrayed a deep respect for Saraphina's strength. "The law's not done here yet, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice steady. "We got the evidence. We got the law behind us. And now we bring them in." Saraphina nodded, but her eyes never left Crane. "Bring them all in," she replied, her voice low but filled with an unspoken promise. "And make sure they never hurt anyone again." The men and women of Copper Ridge, once silent and hesitant, now began to move. The town was waking up, piece by piece, and the shadows that had once protected the guilty were now being pushed aside by the light of truth. The world Saraphina had fought to expose was crumbling before her eyes, and she wasn't going to stop until every last piece of it had fallen. But before the marshal could step forward, there was a shift in the air. The sound of hooves, once distant, grew louder. At first, it was just a few riders, but the thundering beat of horses grew closer and closer until a whole column of riders crested the ridge in the distance. Saraphina's expression didn't change. She had been expecting this. "They're here," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. More of Crane's men. Judge Crane's face turned pale as he saw the approaching riders. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You've only started a war. These men will burn this town to the ground, and you'll be the first to go." Saraphina turned toward the riders, her eyes narrowing as she watched them approach. She wasn't afraid. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice, and she knew she had the power to make it happen. The riders, at first, were just silhouettes on the horizon, but as they neared, their faces became clear. Some were familiar, men who had worked alongside Crane, men who had lived off the suffering of others for years. And there, at the front of the group, was someone Saraphina hadn't expected to see. A man in a black suit, his silver hair gleaming in the sun, rode with the precision and authority of someone used to getting his way. Judge Aldrich Crane's superior, a man who controlled not just Copper Ridge, but the web of corruption that stretched across multiple territories. He had always been untouchable, until now. "Judge Aldrich Crane," Saraphina said, her voice steady. "I suppose you've come to finish what you started." Crane's superior didn't speak at first. Instead, he studied Saraphina with cold, calculating eyes, as if deciding whether she was worth the trouble. "Miss Blackwood," he said finally, his tone smooth, almost respectful. "I must admit, I did not expect this. I thought we had dealt with you long ago." Saraphina's lips curled into a smile, but it was anything but friendly. "You were wrong," she said softly. "You've underestimated me, just like all the others. Do you really think you can change everything, girl?" The man's voice grew colder, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "The system's too big for you. It's bigger than Copper Ridge, bigger than all of you." Saraphina didn't flinch. "I don't need to change everything, just the parts that matter." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded document. The paper was old, the edges tattered from years of handling. As she held it up, the crowd's eyes followed her every move. The document was a death sentence for Judge Crane and all his allies, proof of the crimes they had committed, with signatures and dates that tied them to the very heart of the corruption that had poisoned this land. "This," Saraphina said, her voice carrying to every person within earshot, "is how we take down men like you. The wind howled through Copper Ridge like a harbinger of something inevitable, and the riders, led by Judge Aldrich Crane, circled the town like predators closing in on their prey. The horses' hooves clattered against the dirt, reverberating in the quiet tension that had fallen over the town square. Saraphina stood at the center, unyielding, her gun still holstered but her hand resting just above it, ready to draw at the slightest provocation. The riders, men dressed in fine clothes and heavy armor, had no illusions about the power they wielded. Their gaze lingered on Saraphina, assessing her, trying to gauge if she was a threat, a nuisance, or just an unfortunate part of a larger, more dangerous game. But Saraphina wasn't worried. Her past had taught her to be patient, to bide her time. She had spent 7 years tracking the ones responsible for the crimes that had nearly destroyed her, and now she stood at the precipice, facing the very men who had thought themselves untouchable. Miss Blackwood, the man at the front of the group, Judge Crane's superior, called out. His voice was low, smooth, and deceptively polite, but the malice beneath it was unmistakable. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself, haven't you?" Saraphina didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly, letting her gaze sweep over the crowd. The people of Copper Ridge, the town that had once turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed by Crane and his associates, now stood at a crossroads. They had witnessed the fall of their so-called leaders, and they could no longer pretend ignorance. They knew what Saraphina had exposed, and they knew the truth about what their town had been built on. "We've all been waiting for this day," Saraphina said finally, her voice calm but heavy with resolve. "Waiting for justice. For too long. Men like you have lived like kings while others were treated like cattle. Well, it ends now." Her words rang out across the town square, echoing in the still air, but it was not the words that made the greatest impact. It was the conviction behind them. Every man, woman, and child standing there could feel it. The weight of the truth, the certainty that Saraphina's mission was one of righteousness, and the undeniable belief that she had the power to bring down those who had ruined countless lives. The rider in front of her, his face painted with arrogance, sneered. "You think you could just come in here and undo everything we've built?" His voice was thick with scorn. "You're a child playing with fire. You've had your fun, but it's over now." Saraphina stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the man. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the tension in the crowd like a wire stretched taut, ready to snap at any moment. But her steps were deliberate, calm, unhurried. She had spent years planning for this moment, and she knew it was hers to control. "I'm not here to play," Saraphina said, her voice low and cutting through the noise of the town like a knife through cloth. "I'm here to end what you started, and I've already won." There was a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes now, the briefest moment when his confidence faltered. He had underestimated her, just like everyone else who had seen her as nothing more than a victim. He had thought she would cower, beg for mercy, but Saraphina had never been that kind of girl. Not anymore. Behind the rider, Crane's men shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands twitching near their weapons. They had been on the offensive for so long, controlling everyone and everything around them, that the thought of someone challenging their rule had never truly entered their minds. But now they could see it. This wasn't just about one woman taking on a corrupt judge. It was about a system that had been built on violence, on suffering, on the broken backs of those who had never had the power to stand up. And now the tide had turned. The man in the front, still trying to maintain his composure, spoke again, his voice shaking just slightly. "You're making a mistake, Miss Blackwood. You think you've won because you've cornered 2 old men. But you're only starting a fire you can't control. There are forces you don't understand, forces that will come for you." Saraphina tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Forces?" she asked, her voice almost amused. "Is that what you think? That you can send your lackeys after me, and I'll just disappear? I've been hunted before, you know. It didn't work then, and it won't work now." The man scowled, his hand tightening on the reins of his horse, but it was too late. Saraphina had already done what she came to do. She had exposed the truth, and nothing, No amount of threats or intimidation could change that. A low hum of murmurs rose from the crowd, the townspeople sensing that the final act was at hand. Saraphina's hand moved to her revolver, but not to draw it, just a subtle gesture, a reminder that she was in control. Marshal Pierce, his rifle still aimed at Tobias Kane, nodded to her. It was a silent agreement, an understanding that Saraphina had earned the right to finish what she started. The rider in front of her, now visibly sweating, began to turn his horse, clearly hoping to make a hasty exit. But Saraphina was faster. With one swift movement, she pulled her revolver from its holster, her eyes locked on the man in front of her. She didn't need to fire a warning shot. Her reputation had preceded her. "Leaving so soon?" she called out, her voice carrying over the silence of the square. The rider froze, his heart hammering in his chest. For a brief moment, Saraphina thought he might make a run for it, but then something in his posture sagged. He knew, as she did, that this was the end of the line. The criminal empire that had ruled Copper Ridge and the men who thought themselves invincible were finally going to face the consequences of their actions. Saraphina lowered her gun, taking a step back as the crowd held its collective breath. She could hear the rustling of the wind through the dry grass, the scent of dust heavy in the air. And then, as if on cue, the riders from the other side of town arrived, the federal marshals, the Texas Rangers, and those who had once been Saraphina's fellow victims. They were here to finish what she had started. The man in the black suit, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, finally spoke again, his voice a hollow shell of its former confidence. "You think you've won, but the game is far from over. There are more of us than you know. You'll never be safe." Saraphina's smile was cold, unforgiving. "It's already over, Crane. You just don't know it yet." The riders, now joined by the authorities, closed in. The crowd erupted into motion, people rushing to help with the prisoners, securing them in shackles, and preparing them for transport. Saraphina watched with quiet satisfaction as the men who had once thought themselves untouchable were led away, their heads low in defeat. Saraphina turned back to face the townspeople, her expression hard but not unkind. "Justice takes time," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 7 long years of struggle. "But it will always find a way." The sun hung low in the sky, its rays casting long shadows over Copper Ridge as Saraphina Blackwood stood silently in the town square. The dust from the morning's confrontation had settled, but the tension still clung to the air like a heavy, invisible fog. Behind her, the sound of chains rattled as Tobias Kane and Silas Grim were loaded into a wagon, bound for the nearby federal prison. The two men, once kings in a town built on lies and violence, were now reduced to nothing more than prisoners awaiting their fate. Saraphina's heart didn't rejoice in their downfall. There was no celebration here, only a quiet acknowledgement of the battle that had been won. The road to justice had been long and fraught with peril, but it was far from over. Behind the facade of Copper Ridge's false tranquility, a darkness had been exposed, one that threatened to consume the town entirely. And Saraphina knew that what had been uncovered today was just a fraction of a truth. "Miss Blackwood," Marshal Pierce called out as he approached her, his boots kicking up dust as he walked toward her from the sheriff's office. His expression was hard, but there was something softer in his eyes now. Respect, perhaps, or something more akin to understanding. Saraphina turned to face him, her eyes still cold, still sharp from the years of searching for the truth. "You called me Saraphina," she said, her voice steady, though a tinge of something, satisfaction or regret, perhaps, lingered beneath the surface. "Did I?" Pierce asked, his lips twitching in the faintest of smiles. He'd known her as a child, the girl who'd been sold into darkness and had somehow survived. But what she had become in the years since had left him in awe. "You did," she replied, her voice hardening slightly. "You've been calling me Miss Blackwood all these years. Funny how people change, isn't it?" She let her words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of all she had endured. Marshal Pierce nodded, his gaze flickering to the prisoners in the back of the wagon before returning to her. "Funny," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Silence stretched between them as the world of Copper Ridge continued to churn behind them. The streets were slowly emptying as people went about their business. Yet no one seemed to move with the same carefree abandon as before. The weight of the truth had settled over them all, and for the first time in years, the town was forced to confront the demons it had hidden away for far too long. "Where are you going now?" Pierce asked quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty that had crept into his mind. He had seen what Saraphina had done, how she had broken the chains of her past and set the wheels of justice in motion. But now that the pieces had fallen into place, what would she do next? Where would she go? Saraphina turned her gaze towards the horizon, her face still as stone. "I have a long road ahead of me," she said softly. "There are other networks, other men who think they're untouchable. I'm not done yet." Pierce hesitated, his hand twitching at his side as if unsure whether he should reach out to stop her or let her go. "You've brought down a criminal empire. You've got nothing left to prove." Saraphina smiled, but it wasn't a kind expression. It was the smile of a woman who had seen too much and done too much to believe in easy victories. "Nothing is ever finished until every last piece of it is destroyed," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." Marshal Pierce stood silently for a moment, watching her as she took a step away from him, ready to walk down whatever path she had set for herself. "You don't have to do this alone," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "We're here. We'll help you." Saraphina glanced back at him, her eyes filled with something that might have been gratitude or might have been resignation. "Some things," she said, her voice carrying a weight all its own, "you have to do alone. But I appreciate the offer." Without another word, she turned away and walked toward her horse, the saddle creaking beneath her as she mounted. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the eyes of the town were still on her, some filled with admiration, others with fear. She had come to Copper Ridge as a victim, but she was leaving it as something far more dangerous, a woman with the power to make men like Silas and Tobias tremble. As Saraphina rode out of Copper Ridge, the streets growing smaller behind her, the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The road ahead was long, and she didn't know where it would take her, but one thing was certain. The world was a little bit safer for those who had no voice, and a lot more dangerous for the men who had thought they could silence them. Saraphina Blackwood's ride into the horizon was a journey that would echo through the years. As she moved through the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West, her mind remained fixed on the people she had left behind, the families of the missing children, the survivors, and those who had suffered in silence for too long. The dust kicked up by her horse's hooves seemed to whisper their names, urging her to keep going, to stay focused on the road that still stretched endlessly before her. She knew that the destruction of the trafficking network in Copper Ridge was only the beginning. The files, the documents, the evidence she had gathered, those were just the first steps in a much larger fight. There were still people who thought they were untouchable, still those who believed their power could shield them from the consequences of their actions. But Saraphina had learned long ago that no one was beyond the reach of justice, and now, after years of patient planning, it was her turn to make sure that everyone would pay for what they had done. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Saraphina continued her work. Her name spread across the territories, carried by whispers in the dark corners of saloons and campsites, passed from one lawman to another, from one survivor to the next. She became both a legend and a warning, an unstoppable force whose pursuit of justice knew no bounds. Those who had once seen her as nothing more than a helpless girl now feared the woman she had become. In every town she visited, she left a mark, evidence of her work, carefully placed and meticulously compiled, ready to expose the darkest secrets of the people who thought they were above the law. The people she helped, the children she saved, became her family, her purpose. She no longer hunted alone. The alliances she had built over the years had become her strength. From federal marshals to survivors of the trafficking rings, Saraphina had created a network of justice that stretched across the territories. And yet, despite all the lives she had saved, there was one thing Saraphina could never escape: her past. The scars on her body were a constant reminder of the years she had spent as a prisoner, the years she had spent searching for answers in the wilderness. Every time she looked at those scars, she remembered the night she had been sold for 50, the day her childhood had been stolen from her. But in the end, it was those scars that made her who she was. They were her strength, her resilience, and her will to survive. They had shaped her into a woman who refused to let the past define her, a woman who had learned how to turn the pain into power, how to take control of her own destiny. One evening, as Saraphina stood overlooking a valley at sunset, the sky painted in hues of red and purple, she received word of another trafficking ring, this time operating along the Mexican border. She felt the familiar tug in her chest, the call to continue her work, to keep moving forward. But this time, something was different. This time, the people she had helped, the children she had saved, they were beginning to stand up for themselves. The world was changing, and Saraphina Blackwood had been the spark that ignited the fire of justice. But just as the fire she had started was spreading, so too was the darkness that had once consumed her. The men who had built their empire on lies and suffering were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to return. Saraphina knew that the battle for justice would never truly end. There would always be those who sought to exploit the innocent, who sought to hide in the darkness. But as long as she was alive, she would continue to hunt them down. Her eyes, once filled with the desperation of a victim, were now filled with the unyielding fire of a woman who would never stop fighting. She had been through hell and back, and now she stood at the crossroads of redemption and revenge. She would not rest until every last piece of the puzzle had been put together, until every last predator had been brought to justice. Some debts aren't paid in gold, Saraphina had once said, her voice steady and resolute. They're paid in blood, and she had paid her debt. The blood on her hands was no longer her own. It was the blood of those who had been taken from her, the blood of those who had been stolen from their families, from their lives. She had reclaimed her inheritance, and in doing so, she had become something far greater than what the world had tried to make her. As she rode off into the distance once more, the winds of the desert carrying her forward, Saraphina Blackwood knew that her journey was far from over. The world was still full of darkness, full of monsters that needed to be hunted. But now, with her heart as hard as iron and her resolve even harder, she was ready. Justice, she knew, was a long road, but it was a road she was willing to travel, no matter where it led. And for anyone who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions, they would learn one thing, and they would learn it well. No one is beyond the reach of justice.